Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Denari. My name is Sirish Pulusani, and here we are kicking off 2023 with another recording regarding this war in Ukraine, which started in early 2022. So a lot to cover here as the year started off. First of all, Paul, how's your new year been?
So far, so good. Can't complain. How about you?
Okay, it's been great as well, and like I said, there's a lot to talk about, some changes. So quickly before we get into the details here, just some of the things I want to bring up. Number one, the Wagner Group. This group run by Yevgeny Prigozhin has been gotten a lot more media attention recently. This is a private military group. I don't want to say similar to Blackwater or the previous iteration of Blackwater, but it was actually modeled after Blackwater. But this is probably a way more evil version of Blackwater, essentially. And they are conducting military operations on behalf of Russia, right? And this is, Prigozhin is very closely connected to Vladimir Putin. There's even talk of potential power struggles between them two, power struggles between the Wagner Group and the military, the Russian military. So take us into this situation that's ongoing, and what is this group doing currently? What is their role in the war?
Yeah, it did start off as sort of similar to the American firm Blackwater, which was later called Z, but it was used by Russia as a way of getting involved militarily in places far from Russia's borders in a way that allowed some plausible deniability, right? This isn't the Russian military. This isn't the Russian government. This is a private contractor. But since the war in Ukraine, it's gotten increasingly involved in the war in Ukraine. And most recently, it's been involved in this bitter, violent battle around a town called Bakhmut on the edge of Donetsk Oblast in Ukraine. Basically throwing wave and wave and wave of troops at Ukrainian positions, causing, from what we can tell, very high casualties on both sides. One of the interesting things is that a lot of these recruits on the Russian side who have been basically sort of sent into, the Ukrainian machine guns are former criminals who were basically allowed to leave prison to take places in this Wagner Group. They were recruited last fall, and the idea is serve 6 months with the Wagner Group, and then you'll be free. And they've been using them as cannon fodder, essentially.
Yeah, and like you said, they're literally going to prisons, picking criminals, and promising them like shorter prison terms. Yep. And you're saying they're using them as this disposable entity. Because for Russia, I can understand from Russia's standpoint, these are just criminals they're getting rid of to some degree.
Exactly. So
they're bad people, and then they're on the front lines.
Exactly. From the Russian government perspective, it solves a problem, right? It empties out the prisons. But in the process, maybe, causes a whole bunch of casualties for Ukraine and helps retake some territory. Most of the military experts say, you can never expect these kinds of forces to be trained up to really be effective fighting forces, but they can play some of these certain roles. As long as
how many people are we talking about? How big is the Wagner Group, though? Like, what is their capability?
We have a sense that maybe there are a couple tens of thousands, maybe 40,000 of them in eastern Ukraine now. But but they've built it up with these convicts. And so the number of sort of what you might call professional soldiers, like well-trained Wagner Group soldiers, is much, much smaller. And so there's this sort of competition now. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the guy who runs the Wagner Group, has been at pains to try to show that the Wagner Group can do things that the Russian military can't. And so there's a real conflict now. But the point I want to get at initially, at least, is regardless of how effective they may or may not be, and we can discuss that, there's just a limit to the size of that group. They don't have enough soldiers to go really run the war on the scale that it needs to be run. They can make a contribution in one local place.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think that they're actually having a big influence, or they're going to have a big influence on the actual outcome of the war itself? I
think that's right. The place they're fighting for right now, Bakhmut, is important only symbolically and only because the Wagner Group has made such a big deal out of saying we can do something the regular Russian army can't. Mm-hmm. Almost everybody agrees that even should Bakhmut fall, It doesn't offer the key to any major further advances. It's just one more relatively small city you've controlled, and now you've got to go do the same thing again. So it's become this city that's taken on a symbolic importance far greater than the actual strategical significance.
Mm-hmm. And so the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, there's been talk. I mean, this guy has been known as Putin's chef, I think, for many decades. He's has very close ties with Putin, run international operations around the globe. In fact, on his behalf, even Twitter troll farms, in fact, are potentially being run by him. So he's a bad actor on the world stage. But they're saying he is a potential contender to power for Putin, that he's a challenger to Putin's throne, so to speak. Is that the case?
Well, yes and no. He clearly, like Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, who also kind of has his own army, these guys are definitely vying for a more prominent role in Russia today and jockeying for position post-Putin. I think and clearly, he is now at odds with the Russian, the Ministry of Defense and the regular Russian military, and I think they all hate each other now. It's not a great recipe for fighting a war. However, for Putin, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because from his perspective, right, the biggest danger to him is that somebody becomes powerful enough that they think they can take him out. And with the Ministry of Defense and and Prigozhin and company hating each other, right, they both have to fear the other one. And that actually helps Putin's security, because neither of those wants to see the other one supplant Putin.
Is this intentional
this is a classic sort of divide and conquer tactic?
Yeah, is this intentional on Putin's part? It seems like he's always playing these type of games.
I think it is. And then there's also sort of the FSB, right? The spy agency, which is not just a spy agency, right? It's got a lot of force of its own. So there's always been this idea of creating a plurality of so-called guys with guns, force organs, so that none of them, right, could have confidence enough that it could take over.
So you just named three different ones: the Wagner Group, the FSB, and the military itself, right?
Yep.
The FSB is what I assume to have that Putin has the most direct control over. Is that the case?
I think that's right, and I think that's the one that's probably most loyal to him. He comes from the FSB; these are his people. He's known many of them for decades, and they probably have the most to lose should he lose power.
What role are they playing in this conflict?
I don't think they're playing a direct role right now on the front, but certainly they're playing a big role in Russia itself in terms of mopping up the opposition to Putin, making sure that his domestic enemies are taken care of. And you have to assume that they're keeping very close track of people like Prigozhin, Kadyrov, the generals, right, to make sure that none of them get out of line.
Mm-hmm. And the people who have gone out of line, I mean, there's some random stories that have come out of people in the military who have expressed some sort of, discontent with the war or something like that. And Putin has essentially murdered them, right? I mean, I guess he just sends the FSB after them. And so everybody kind of has this hanging over their head. You're saying including people like Prigozhin and Kadyrov. I mean, he runs a country, but he still has to worry about the FSB coming after him.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question now. Just say, for example, right, if Putin were decided it was time to get rid of Kadyrov, what kind of gun battle would there be, in order to arrest the guy? I think Kadyrov probably has a lot of people around him who would fight for him, because without Kadyrov, they're not. So you have this sort of, these creation of these independent fiefs with their own armies that doesn't bode well for long-term stability in Russia. Mm-hmm. In the short term, it probably helps Putin keep things under control. But in the long term, it's a recipe for civil war.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Russia has claimed to have made significant advances in one of Ukraine's regions after months of stalemate. Yep. I think it's the southeastern region is a Zaporizhia. Moscow installed. They said the front is now mobile. Whatever that means. Essentially, it's a moving front. But what does this? Does this really mean anything? Is what I really want to get to, because at the end of the year, it really looked like all the momentum was going in Ukraine's favor. It was like, they had stopped the Russians and everything else. And now it seems to be that there's some shift in that momentum recently. How real is this?
The answer is I don't know. I think it's going to take a few days or maybe even a week for that situation to clarify itself. Is there really a significant Russian offensive kind of along the southern front? or is this basically an information operation? And if so, I think it's primarily aimed at Putin's critics within Russia. Because to the extent Putin is criticized in Russia these days, it's not from people who are opposed to the war. It's from people who think they haven't been prosecuting it ardently enough.
That's where the loudest voices are coming in Russia. Is people aren't going hard enough.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what is Putin's response to that?
Putin's response has been generally to dissociate himself from the bad news and to simply try to remind people, in his view, right, that Russia is fighting for its survival and that the West is out to annihilate Russia. I mean, that's kind of his line. Mm-hmm. But he I think he's willing to let these critics go up to a point. But I also think to the extent that he thinks that the criticism is really beginning to sting, he'll begin to rein it in.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, we've had discussions, like how much of the Russian population actually believes stories like this, and I'm sure there's a significant amount that probably does, and it's probably hard to gauge, essentially, as well, how much of the Russian population really believes some of these stories. One of the things I like to think about is, up until, the Soviet Union fell, there was many in the Soviet Union who had that same point of view, right? That Americans are the evil empire and they were coming, and then all of a sudden everything collapsed, right? So what do you like? So like, how realistic is that? There's a significant majority of people who are actually believing Putin's thing, or is this just a house of cards just waiting to just come down now?
I'm not sure how many people really believe everything Putin says, but nor do I believe that it's a house of cards. I think if we've learned anything over the last 10 months, it's that the idea that there was going to be either some upswelling of opposition to Putin or the idea that Russia's will to fight was simply going to collapse, simply not the case. I would look at it this way, Sirish. Russia's at war. And most people in most countries, most of the time, if their country's at war, won't ask too many really hard questions other than to say, let's go get them, right? And so I think that's especially true in a country where nobody's really getting good information about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So you brought up a good point there. The country is at war. Now, Putin said that there's a conflict in Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine. He didn't even use the term war.
Right.
And we've discussed before how this has always been existential for the Ukrainian side, but it hasn't really been for the Russian side. But potentially for Putin, it could be in the long term. But as far as the Russian people themselves are concerned, did they ever feel under threat? I mean, you said it's a war going on, but it's kind of, I mean, is it like when the Iraq war happens, I don't think any American really felt like their safety, being concerned for, but we were sending troops overseas and dealing with this war, for instance, right? But does Russia, is a Russian citizen thinking about that?
Well, I think it's worth remembering, that the Bush administration very cleverly sort of dropped a lot of hints without ever saying anything that could be called a lie, right? Basically tried to promote this idea that Iraq had somehow been behind 9/11, which is categorically false. And at the time of the war, something like 25 or 30% of the American people believed that. And so, and that's in a country with a pretty robust free media. And of course, we know that after that war started, something like 80 or 90% of the American people sort of supported the war. And so you can kind of get a sense of, I don't think that before this war, Russians felt that there was an existential threat. But I think now that the war's on, I think there's this idea of if this war ends, it's national. I mean, if Russia loses this war, it's national humiliation for Russia. And I don't think most Russians want their country to be humiliated.
Mm-hmm. Well, what does that look like in a Russian's mind? What does that look like to lose this war is what I want to get into. Like, is it just a neutral ceasefire? Is it like a withdrawal of troops from those regions? I mean, like, what is that? It's hard to even imagine at this point what it even looks like.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I'm not sure the average Russian thinks very hard, right? If all that happens, is that Russia has the same borders it had, a year ago, what's so bad about that, right? But it
would be a defeat.
So, say again?
It would be a defeat. That would be a defeat.
The United States lost the war in Vietnam without ever losing a square inch of territory. But it was a national, it was viewed as a humiliation. that drove weird stuff in American politics for the next 50 years, and to some extent continues to today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And it was, right? Because at the end of the day, the United States didn't really get its strategic objectives, which Russia is not doing currently either, right? And they're taking a massive toll on their military and economic security.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for a country like Russia, I mean, I think about the legitimacy of its government, right? But what is it that makes Putin's government legitimate, or the Russian government, Putin or post-Putin or pre-Putin? What is it that makes it legitimate? Well, for a long time, there was a growing standard of living, which was based simply on increasing global energy prices. And there was this renewed sense in Russian pride as Russia got more and more belligerent vis-a-vis the West. Mm-hmm. So sanctions, along with things in global energy markets, the Russian economy is not growing. And so what else is there to justify this Russian government other than winning this war? Mm-hmm. So it is a real problem for Putin particularly, but for Russian governance and government more generally, if they lose this war.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of losing the war, it looks like the West is ramping up, or at least plans to ramp up, sending certain things. Most recently, though, one of the news headlines is that diplomatic tensions are simmering as Western allies continue to pressure Germany to authorize the delivery of its modern Leopard 2 battle tank to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has warned that Ukraine will bear the consequences of other countries supply it with tanks. Tell us about this Leopard 2 and why what's going on with Germany supplying these tanks.
Yeah, the Leopard 2 is it's a big, what's called a main battle tank, right? Which means tracked, heavily armored, and with a big old cannon on the front of it. There are a couple thousand of them in arsenals around Europe. It's the primary main battle tank that European armies have bought, primarily because the American main battle tank, what's called the Abrams M1A1, is so big and so difficult and expensive to run that other countries haven't really bought as many of them. So there are a couple thousand of these things that could fairly easily be transitioned to Ukraine. But Germany built them, and then when they export them, and this is true of a lot of military exports, they're exported with a clause in the contract that says you need our permission to then re-export them to somebody else. And so far, the Germans haven't been willing to give that permission. And, the Germans have been pretty waffly about the reasons why. But basically, the German government it wants to have it both ways, right? Which is it wants to say that it's helping Ukraine, but it doesn't want to irritate Russia. But there's also a domestic part of this, which is there's still a big swath of German society that, for various reasons, doesn't really want to be involved in this war. Mm-hmm. And so that's the problem. And Ukraine is getting increasingly frustrated. The rest of the Western allies are getting increasingly frustrated. But last week there was a big conference, and as yet the Germans have not budged. Their way of passing the buck is to say, if we're going to give our tanks, we want the Americans to give their tanks. The Americans aren't giving their tanks in large part because the American tanks are utterly unsuitable for Ukraine's purposes.
Mm. So it's not that you're saying that it's not about the Americans not wanting to provide like arms necessarily.
Well, I would love to know exactly what the conversations are like inside the White House, because if it were me, I would say, look, these American tanks are totally unsuitable for use by the Ukrainians, but let's give them 10 of them anyhow. Right, just so that the Germans don't have this excuse anymore. Mm. But it seems to me that maybe there's some hesitation in the Biden administration as well. But
do you think these tanks would be very significant in Ukraine's ability to really kind of endure the Russian advances and even potentially retake territory?
I think yes, and more to the point, the military people who know more than I do say yes. And so Russia, for example, it's taken all this territory across southern Ukraine, and you just mentioned Zaporizhia. It's got all this territory, and it's now been digging trenches, right? Digging in as a way of holding that territory. If you have to attack those trenches with infantry, that's World War I. That's like what Russia is doing in the East, and all it does is get thousands or hundreds of thousands of people killed. But if you have tanks that can punch through those lines and get around behind them, right, then you have basically World War II, in which case, you capture, you encircle the enemy's forces and take them out very quickly.
Yeah.
So armor potentially is a game changer in the war.
This is fascinating because the world at large, the modern U.S. Army is moving away from tanks. You would almost think that land battles like this aren't common, but it goes back to something I read. That if Russia's invasion of Ukraine has confirmed one thing, is that peace on the continent cannot be taken for granted. And I think it goes on to say the status quo, decades of low spending in defense not being a policy priority, cannot continue. Essentially, was the argument here. So is this what you believe? I mean, the case is they need to ramp up defense spending and give them the damn tanks, right?
Well, this is the paradox of all basically of Europe, but especially Germany and France, which is they get very cranky at the idea that the United States is going to lead everything, but they refuse themselves to actually do anything, right? Or in this case, we won't do it until the Americans go first. So they want to have it both ways, and they could have it both ways, right? As long as they were cozying up to Russia, and Russia wasn't attacking its neighbors. But now it's very hard, and it's like, okay, if the Americans decide that they're not going to do this, right? Mm-hmm. You're either going to have to put up, or you're going to have to deal with the Russians on the border of Germany again.
That's a scary thought.
It should be, but everybody seems to be worried about it except the Germans.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it almost is, because it seems so implausible, like that something like that could happen. But if we know one thing throughout the course of history, is that the most implausible things can and will happen, right? I mean, it's just an inevitability at a certain point. So, well, it remains to be seen, Paul. Very insightful as always. A lot of great information. We'll continue having these discussions. But yeah, thanks as always, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Take care, Sirish.
All right. Take care.